Matthew Dowda was getting divorced. He was married 12 years, had 4 children, and owned a small wheat farm. He was large, broad-shouldered, with strong arms and calm. He got along easily with people. He loved his wife, but she wanted more. Life was hard. His wife, Lucille, was a bitch. She was a beauty. She was never happy with anything. She always left the house, usually on Friday and Saturday evenings. She often did not return home for 2 or more days. The children, aged 10, 8, 6, and 3, were often left alone. Thank God they had Mrs. Delano. The house was barely functioning. The farm was suffering. He's tired of it. When he was able to get into the VFW, the general consensus was, leave her. She's already left you. He wasn't a veteran, but his father was, and he'd been going there with him since he was 6. His father was a Vietnam veteran and well known there. He was an army sergeant, an ordinary soldier, but he had a bucket full of medals for doing the right thing. Several of the guys there knew him personally or had heard of him. He was a farmer, and after 6 years in the army returned to this business. He married his high school sweetheart. 2 years later, Matthew was born to them. She had complications and never fully recovered from the birth. 8 years later, she died. My father never got over it. It was just him and his father. In the 11th grade, his father died. A lot of time had passed since then, but Matt was sure that his father had died of a broken heart. So Matt inherited the farm, a small insurance payout, and Mrs. Delano, their housewife. He met Lucille and fell in love. They got married and all hell broke loose. When she became pregnant with Mary, her doctor told her to abstain from sex until after the birth. 6 weeks later, they had sex again, and voila, she was pregnant again. The same pattern repeated itself over and over again. 3 more times, but after little Monica was born, she completely refused him sex. 2.5 years. One evening at the VFW, the conversation turned to his deadbeat wife and lack of sex. One of the guys was a lawyer, retired Captain Al Lozano. He believed Matt was being used and played, and agreed to take the case for free if he was serious, without any consulting. Playing? Matt asked. He thought he meant cheating, but his friends were looking at the bigger picture. A guy named Gino said, "Have you ever noticed how she refuses you when she gets pregnant? And it's really convenient that she gets pregnant with such regularity. And now, when was the last time you had sex? The baby is already 2.5 years old. Come on, son, count it." Suddenly, a light bulb went on in Matt's head. Then Gino went even further. "Have you done DNA tests on the kids? Are you sure they're yours?" Matt turned pale, and that was all. He stood up with fire in his eyes. "They are mine. I know what you mean, but it doesn't matter. They are mine." Gino didn't move. He simply looked at the young man, feeling only pity. He was a police lieutenant detective and saw this too often in his work. Al, the lawyer, grabbed his arm and pulled him down. "Calm down, Matt. If that's the case, it's not the kid's fault. And from the way you talk about them, they're not involved or to blame for this. If you don't want to know, that's fine." He felt sorry for Matt. He would never have thought that the young man was so naive and stupid. But love, you know. They talked for a while, and he made an appointment with Al. They drew up the documents, and he applied. He didn't have much, and he had to offer her half. Equal access to children. She could keep the farmhouse, but he kept the land and equipment. He took on all the debts. More than a fair settlement. Her response was stunning. Her lawyer offered to renounce her parental rights and any claims to the house. In turn, she wanted all the money in their bank accounts and savings and a clear dissolution of their union without any future claims. She just wanted to leave. So he had to pay about $37,000 to get rid of her. His lawyer went over everything with him, pointing out the pros and cons. He recommended accepting a counteroffer if he thought he could afford it. Without hesitation, he signed, and the document was certified and returned to her lawyer almost immediately, his lawyer rushing with the original copy 10 minutes after certification. On the way, he left it in court to speed up the process. Matt went home to tell Mrs. Delano. Her comment. Finally, I promised your parents that I would take care of you and your family. I'm sorry for the way that woman treated you and those poor children. But this is the best scenario you could hope for. Don't worry about the money. With a pension from my late husband and Social Security, we'll get through it. It might be tough, but we'll get through it. She hugged him. So it was only a matter of time, 3 months, 92 days to be exact. Things started to look up. His eldest daughter fell ill with appendicitis. Nothing major, but without major health insurance, the bills started to mount. Mary was in the hospital for 4 days. Michael, his son, took responsibility and was proud of his father. What little he could do. Little Jasmine and Monica more or less just followed everyone around. Then a drought set in and the wheat crop began to suffer. The tractor died with a blown gearbox. It's time for his truck to get its inspection and registration renewal. The roof started leaking, taxes went up, the county sent notice to rezone the farm, the state and feds were about to put a 6-lane freeway through the center of the farm, and then his dog died. The only bright spot was his divorce, which went through, and he went to Al's office to pick up the decree. Al asked if there was anything he could do to help. Half jokingly, he said, "Yeah, can you make sure I win the Powerball this Saturday?" Al smiled and said he would try his best. Matt told him that with the current financial situation, it would be some time before he could afford to return to the VFW, even with cheap beer. He stood up, shook Al's hand, and thanked him. After Matt left, Al said a silent prayer. "Oh my God, the baby needs a break. Let's see if you can help him." Matt went home to have dinner with soup and hot dogs. The next day, he had to begin harvesting. He just hoped the unification would hold up. This continued for about 23 of the field. Then the hydraulics failed. Matt sat in the taxi and cried. About 2 hours. Then he shook himself, wiped his eyes, walked to the barn, got into a pickup truck and drove to the VFW. He walked in and ordered a beer. He was immediately noticed by Jerry Wallen, a retired lieutenant colonel who was a day trader. He did well, earning about $100,000 a year. He walked over and sat down next to Matt. 20 minutes and 6 beers later, he heard the whole story, called Al and Gino, and switched Matt to coffee. His last call was to his daughter Alice, a school teacher. She recently moved to the area after her husband left her for a stripper in New Orleans. Her ex told her he didn't want kids, and neither did Bambi, so they broke up. His wife passed away 2 years ago, and she thought her father needed support. In fact, he handled it much better than she thought, but he was quite sure that she was the one who needed support. Besides, Alice was a much better cook than him, so they helped each other. Al and Gino arrived, and a very hesitant Alice came in shortly after. Her father wasn't forthcoming about the reason why he asked her to join them, but Jerry was getting a little tired of his daughter moping around under the guise of fussing around behind him. "I think it's time to reintroduce her to the real world," he thought. 4 men were huddled around one of the small tables when Alice entered. She saw her father and approached them. The introductions were made, and when she looked at Matt, her world stopped. He looked at her and smiled at her through his beer-soaked consciousness. Then he lost consciousness. Alice gasped, sat up, and grabbed his head. "Dad, what's going on?" Over the next half hour, she told Matt's life story. Her concern turned to pity, followed by love. This poor guy has nothing but 4 kids, a crap full of debt and problems, and people who take care of him. He's worse off than me, she thought. She looked at her father. "Let's take him home. He doesn't have to be here. He needs a family." So they loaded him into her Explorer and drove him home. Mrs. Ray Delano came out and met them in the yard as Alice and Al pulled him out of the car. They put him to bed, tidied him up a bit, and went into the living room for coffee. Little Monica hung on Mrs. Delano's leg while the adults talked, gawking at Alice, who smiled and waved at her, while Al brought the 63-year-old woman up to speed. But soon Monica was sitting on Alice's lap, giggling and muttering something blue. Alice was 30 years old. She is 5'3", 110 pounds, slim, 34B breasts, and nice legs. She was the girl next door, sweet but not amazing. With glasses, short brown hair, and dimples, she was almost the exact opposite of Lucille. She was slightly broken. Maybe not on the same scale as Matthew, but it still hurt her. A few minutes later, her father arrived and joined them. He and Gino secretly made inquiries about the whereabouts and status of Matt's ex-wife. It turns out she took her ill-gotten gains and took one of her childhood toys to Vegas. Then Daoud's 3 older children came home from school and came across a house full of people they didn't know. Shock. Except for Mrs. Delano and Miss Alice. She was a teacher at their school. In fact, Mary took her to her first English lesson. They asked what happened because the 2 older ones felt that something was wrong or something was going on. They sat down and Mrs. Delano talked to them and Miss Alice consoled them. They cried for quite a long time. Your timing is perfect, Lucille. Lucille Dowd, now Lucille Bowman, left town with her current sex buddy and just over $35,000 in cash after cashing in Matt's divorce agreement. She just wanted to get away from her shitty life, her 4 brat, and the small town she grew up in. She thought marrying Matthew Dowd would be a step forward because he had a 2,000-acre farm. In her opinion, it meant money. God, was she stupid, and she was naive. Farm life was difficult and all-consuming. She had to go out. One day she went into town to buy groceries while Matt was working in the fields. She never made it to the grocery store. While walking along the sidewalk, she was stopped by a well-dressed middle-aged man and spoke to him at a nearby bar. 3 hours later, she was lying on her back in a motel room having sex with this guy. Thus began her depraved life. For 11 years, she had sex day and night, and Matt's money too. He kept giving her money, and she kept spending it. Then her boyfriend came up with a pregnancy scam. 4 children later, she cut him off completely, saying she didn't want any more children. He loved her, and working on the farm was all-consuming. Once he had harvested the crops and sold them, she would take most of the money and leave again, for 5 days or a week. For 10 years, more or less, this continued. Finally, he had had enough. So he applied. 92 days later, he became a free man. Now his life could go on. But what's left? He had almost no money, no bills, and no repairs to do. One of the bright spots was Alice. She became a rock, a constant presence in his world. Mrs. Delano approved of this proposal, but warned him to behave himself. Matt never even thought otherwise. He didn't have 2 cents to rub together, and after 3 weeks he told Alice that she should find someone else. He couldn't even afford to ask her out. And work on the farm, no matter what he could do, consumed almost all the free time he had. But he liked it when she was around. She liked to be around, and his kids absolutely loved having her around. So what's the problem? The problem was that he didn't see any way to improve the situation, so he just let it run its course. Now bear with me. Karma was associated with several small fortunes around the world. Ukraine, political unrest in Israel, communist Chinese incursions around the world, racial and social unrest in the U.S. She really didn't pay attention to the simpler things in the world. I'm so ashamed, she thought. A short mental look into her subconscious, and she came across Mr. Steve's Matthew Dowd. Wow! Even she was amazed at his circumstances. Poor guy, he had a hard time. Where is his ex-wife? Maybe she should get a little justice? No, wait, I have a better idea. Karma thought for a moment and smiled. Yes, much better, she thought. He received notice from the hospital that he owed bills for his daughter's appendectomy. They demanded immediate payment, otherwise they would start legal proceedings. So he went to the hospital to talk to the finance department. On the way, he thought he should stop and talk to Mr. Dois Lozano, but he had already done so much for him. No, he'll figure out what his options are first, and then decide what to do, if he can. 2 hours later, he left the hospital even more depressed than when he entered. They told him it was out of their hands. The case will be referred to a collection agency if he does not pay. He had to mortgage his farm and pay the bill in full within 60 days, and he thought it couldn't get any worse. Well, he decided a visit to his lawyer couldn't hurt. As he approached his truck, he saw a piece of paper on the ground. Apart from that piece of paper, everything was clean. Something persistently pulled his attention. He stopped and bent down to pick up a small piece of paper. He stared at him. Lottery ticket. For this Saturday. Well, maybe I'll get lucky and win a couple of dollars so I can buy pizza for dinner. Or even enough to take Alice to the movies and Burger King, he thought. He put the ticket in his pocket, got into the truck, started it, and drove to his lawyer's office. After parking at the building where Al's office was located, he parked in the adjacent lot. The elevator took him to the 4th floor, and he walked towards the glass doors and entered the reception area. The secretary looked up, smiled, and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Dowd. Mr. Lozano just returned from lunch, but it seems you have no appointment. Can I help you?" "Matilda, I have a problem. I need to ask a couple of questions. Do you think he can accept me?" "Let me check, Mr. Dowd. Sit down, please." She picked up the phone and talked for a couple of seconds. Then she turned and said, "Wait a couple minutes, okay?" "Of course," Matt muttered. He plopped down in a chair and almost lost his composure. 10 minutes later, the internal phone rang and Matilda answered and nodded to Matt. "Come in, Mr. Dowd. He is waiting for you." Matt stood up and walked down the short hallway to Al's office. As if I haven't been here too many times, he thought. Al Lozano stood up as Matt entered his office. "Sorry about the wait, Matt. I had an urgent matter. How can I help?" Matt laid out his latest problem, handed him the papers from the hospital, and fell apart. Al calmly read the papers, sighed, and looked at the young man. He just can't get a break. Yeah, God, Al thought. Well, they're playing a tough game, but you don't own the property. It's collateral, so it doesn't mean anything. But they can refer the case to a collection agency. This is what hospitals do. It will just add to your hassle. If you can't pay, there's nothing you can do. So my advice is, if they don't help smooth out the payment schedule, just ignore them, and we'll worry about everything else when that happens. Anything new from the county about rezoning, or from the state about the proposed freeway?" Matt grabbed his head and collapsed. "Nothing new. Just what we got last week." He groaned. Al sighed again. "Don't worry, buddy. It won't help. We will jump over that bridge when we come to it. To quote the movie, go home and have a beer. Just one thing, okay?" "How about some lemonade?" "There's no money for beer," Matt answered gloomily. He stood up, shook Al's hand, and left. 5 minutes later, he was walking to his truck, his mind racing in 100 different directions at once. As he approached his truck, he noticed the dog. She was about 4 months old. She was just lifting her paw to pee on the back tire on the driver's side of his truck when she looked up and saw him. He shouted, "Hey," at her, but the animal finished its job and then ran up to him, wagging its tail and sticking out its tongue. It came up to him and rubbed against his leg, making all sorts of affectionate sounds. "Well, you sure are cute, buddy, but this is my pickup truck that you just decorated." But he was a cute dog, and he leaned over to pet him and scratch his head, while checking for the presence of a collar and tags. Nothing. Maybe he's microchipped. The veterinary clinic was offering free chip testing for lost dogs, so he hurried to his truck, opened the door, and whistled. The puppy jumped up and jumped in as if it was second nature to him, as if it were his home. Matt looked at him. "You almost look like Spike when he was younger." Spike just died after living for 15 years. Another blow of fate, Matt thought. He shuddered, got into the truck, and drove to the 24-hour veterinary clinic. He pulled up to the place he'd been taking Spike since he was a puppy. He threw a piece of rope around his neck. He led him inside. Luckily, it was a little after 2, and there was no one in line. They took his details and said it was free, but donations were always welcome. He winced, took out his wallet, and noticed that he had $7 left. He sighed, looked at the puppy, and put $5 in the donation box. The young girl smiled at him, said thank you, and took the dog to the back. Matt followed her, and she sat him down on the examination table. She took the magic wand, all the while talking to the dog, telling him what a good boy he was. She ran the wand over his back, sides, stomach, and twice around his neck. She finished and showed him the digital display. Nothing, Mr. Dowd. I tested it completely because some people can get very creative with chipping. But he's clean. Bring him back later for all the other vaccinations. She looked at him and smiled. But I'll give him a rabies vaccination now, free of charge. She went and got the vaccine and gave the dog an injection. He didn't even flinch. Thank you, miss. What should I do with it? She looked at him, slightly surprised. You're not going to leave him? She asked. I don't know. What options do I have? Well, we can't take him. It's against city rules. And we don't have room. If you take him to a shelter, they'll keep him there for 2 weeks or so. And if no one comes for him or takes him, well, you know. If you just let him go, the dog walker will eventually catch him, and that will give him another week or 2. But the end result will be the same. I looked at the puppy. Looks like you're coming home with me. I wonder how it will turn out. Yes, right. So we went and opened the passenger door, and he jumped in, and I rolled down the window and got in the truck and drove to the farm. I drove up and, with a rope in my hand, went into the house. Hello, Dad is at home. I have a surprise. The patter of small feet and 4 children, an attractive young girl and an elderly woman, wiping their hands on a towel, entered the living room. Dog, we have a new dog. As I thought, Alice was speechless. Mrs. Delano shook her head, but smiled. The children surrounded him and noticed the rope. Dad, we can't treat him like that, Michael said. He removed the rope, stood up, and went out into the kitchen, returning with Spike's old collar. It was an almost perfect fit. But his name? Spike the second, Dad, said Mary. Well, that's settled, I thought. We moved into the dining room with lots of laughter and games and ate hot dogs and beans, iced tea, a salad Mrs. Delano had picked from the garden, and some hard-boiled eggs from our chickens. Not very varied, but useful. We are poor, after all. After dinner, we cleaned up. I gave Spike one of the last cans of Alpo we had from his predecessor, and we went into the living room. We watched TV for a while. The kids had already done their homework, so Alice said goodnight, kissed me on the cheek amidst shouts of "ooh," and went home. We went to bed. Tomorrow was Friday, another day in paradise. Friday has passed. I was able to sell the remainder of the wheat crop I had harvested before the combine broke down, and I went home and paid the most pressing bills, including registering my truck. I still had to pass the inspection, but that gave me a few more days to spare. Alice came with KFC and everything we needed, and we had dinner. She stayed a little longer, and we played board games with the kids and Mrs. Delano, and she left around 10:30, another nice kiss on the cheek, but with a hug. The children were busy. On Saturday, I was on edge. I slept late. After coffee and jelly toast, I went and washed the rest of my farm equipment in preparation for sale, washed the truck, mowed the front lawn, and ate lunch. Then I went and sat in the kitchen, going through the remaining bills and reading the mail. Depressing. Alice arrived around 4:00 p.m., and we made plans for dinner. Spaghetti. Nothing special, but Alice bought garlic bread. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The TV was turned on. We watched some nonsense, and then the news started. The usual school stuff, a burglary, a story about freeway expansion, then sports, with a review of how the Kansas City Chiefs lost on Thursday Night Football. Then a short announcement about the Powerball drawing, right after the commercial. Alice sat to my right, and Mary came and sat to my left. Hey, Dad, why don't we ever try the lottery? Maybe we'll get lucky. I turned and looked at her. All you have to do is buy a ticket, Dad. Ticket, ticket. Why did this word stick in my mind? Ticket. I jumped up and rushed to my room, grabbed my dirty work shirt, and in the top pocket, crumpled and folded, was a ticket. Somehow this ticket was supposed to be our salvation. I rushed back to the living room to my confused girlfriend, slightly scared eldest daughter, surprised third daughter, and curious son. My youngest daughter chewed on a cookie and watched the whole thing with a smile. I plopped down on the sofa between my two daughters and showed them the small piece of paper. At that moment, the TV came back from commercials, and the Powerball drawing began with its advertising copy about what the winning numbers would bring. The Powerball jackpot for tonight's $237,000. Here are today's winning numbers. Good luck. And so they began. 10, 12, 22, 36, 50, and the red Powerball. 7, Matt said. He looked at the ticket in his hand while the host read the numbers and clearly said the red ball number right before the host did so while looking at the screen. 7, said the man on the television. 7, 7, he said 7. His daughter looked on in amazement and Alice was stunned. By this time, Michael had joined them and was just beginning to understand what was happening. But his question shocked everyone. We won. Did we win, Dad? All Matt could say was repeat 7, 7, 7, over and over again. His body was in a trance, but his mind was racing subconsciously. 4 children, 1 housewife, a sweet girlfriend, and a new dog. 7. 7 people and things in my life that mean the most to me. 7. 7. He was stuck in this thought. Alice talked to him, shook him. Matt, dear, talk to me. His daughter began to sob and cry. Dad, you're scaring me. Michael was nervous, Jasmine was crying her eyes out, and Monica stopped eating her cookies and watched. Alice finally picked up her cell phone and called her father. Hi, honey, how are you? He didn't finish. Dad, I think Matt had some kind of seizure, stroke, or spasm. I don't know what. But I need you to come as soon as possible. Okay, honey, call an ambulance. I'm on my way. He passed out, grabbed the keys, and rushed to the door. Alice hesitated, remembering the lottery ticket, and decided not to call an ambulance. In addition, her friend began to come to his senses and laugh, looking at everyone like crazy. It's okay now. Think. Everything is fine. Maybe great. He turned and looked at Alice. Smiling, he said, You called me darling. She blushed and muttered, Well, I was worried about you. She hesitated. Honey, she said shyly, looking away from Matt's face. Then she turned and looked into his eyes intently. Oh, and also, I love you, and your children, and Mrs. Delano. Then, with a mischievous smile, and your dog, too. Well, now that it looks like I'm rich, we can talk about. Just a minute, Matthew Dowd. I loved you when you were literally a beggar. I'm not some gold digger looking for a rich sugar daddy. Money means nothing to me. We can tear up a lottery ticket and flush it down the toilet, and I will still love you. Matt was stunned. At that moment, Alice's father arrived and burst into the house. Well, the front door was open, and he didn't damage anything, but he was in a hurry. He entered, stopped, and looked around. Not exactly what he expected 4 excited kids. A smiling 31-year-old guy with his arm around his daughter, the daughter beaming with happiness, but a little angry, an old lady sitting in a rocking chair laughing, and a small dog running around, looking everywhere for attention. So, what's going on here? He asked. Alice held Matt's gaze for a moment, then turned and looked at her father. Matthew Dowd just won the lottery, Dad, and he also said he loved me. She turned back to Matt and glared at him. And I love him too. As long as rich guys don't mind poor school teachers, she laughed. Jerry looked at Alice, then at Matt. He saw the ticket in Matt's hand and walked over and sat on their small coffee table and asked to look at the ticket. Matt hesitated, then handed the ticket to Jerry. Jerry examined the front, then turned it over, checking the back. Looks okay, he thought. He noticed that the ticket was not signed. He took out his smartphone. I assume you don't have the internet, Matt? Matt blushed. No, sir, too expensive. Jerry noticed an old model television. It even had the old bunny ears antenna on top. He opened the Powerball app on his phone and got today's numbers. Of course, the ticket matched. It was a winner. When and where did you get it? He asked, handing it back to Matt. 2 days ago, when I left Al's office, I found him on the ground. Jerry thought for a moment. Then he made a decision. Sign it on the back right now. Then on Monday, we'll go to Al and I'll talk to my friend who is a financial advisor, if you want. You look very worried, sir. Is there something wrong? Well, if you want my advice, we need to get a lawyer, and since Al Lozano is your lawyer, it would make sense. And considering that my daughter says she loves you, and you could be worth a lot of money, I think you should take all reasonable precautions. There will be more information by Monday about where and how the ticket was sold. You cannot buy a ticket with a credit card, so it will be a cash transaction. We also find out how many other tickets have winning numbers. This way, we will have an idea of how the money will be distributed. Then, you'll need to decide how you want to get the money, how much you want to get, and how you want to distribute it. Do you understand at least half of these things? Sober thoughts ran through Matt's head. It was a little more than just money, but Jerry was right. He stood up and went to get the pen. He signed the back of the ticket and returned to the group. He showed Jerry, who nodded. So now we wait until Monday. I'll call my friend, and you call Al, and we'll meet on Monday. He shook Matt's hand and turned to leave. And Matthew, he said. Matt looked at him. Sir? Behave yourself, he said, smiling and casting a sidelong glance at his daughter. Dad, she blushed. Jerry walked away smiling. After all, they were both over 30 years old. The next morning, under the good influence of Alice and Mrs. Delano, they went to church, bought donuts, and returned home for a quiet day. Monday started out calm and clear. It turned out that only one ticket was sold for Saturday's drawing. It was also reported that it was sold for cash at a general store out of town. There was no video, which meant anyone could buy it. It also turned out that Matt was refueling there, so the ticket was practically invisible. Legal, but for all practical purposes, untraceable. They arrived at Al Lozano's office and were ushered into a large conference room. Alice had to go to work teaching school, so it was just Matt and Jerry with Al and Jerry's friend Art, a local investment banker. He had a good reputation and had served in the army many years ago. More importantly, he knew Matt's father from old times and always liked Matt. They got down to business. Al looked at the lottery ticket, listened to the story, and thought for a moment. He looked at Matt. Art studied his laptop, looking at the lottery website. He took notes and reflected. Matthew, Al said, what do you want to do? It is up to you. From what I've seen, the ticket is legal and yours. All we have to do is cash it out and... Art smiled and raised his head. He nodded and interrupted Al. In principle, what Mr. Lozano said is correct. The lottery commission determined that only one ticket had been sold to a person or persons unknown, and they were waiting for it to be redeemed. You have 1 year to cash it out, and after that the money is gone. Now, if you decide to cash out and want all the money, it will be divided into a payout of approximately $177,700,000, based on the original amount of $237,000. Then, the feds will take at least 25% of that amount in taxes, but it will likely be a maximum rate of 37% when you file your taxes next year. So I would recommend giving them the entire amount right away, considering that you will receive that much. If you choose an annuity, you will receive approximately 30 years of payments, dividing the total amount into usually 360 payments. You will receive the full amount minus taxes, but it will be in smaller amounts over a longer period. Understand? I think yes. Al, how much do I need to pay all my bills, take care of my family, and do what I want in my life? Al looked at Jerry and Art. Both men consulted on their notes. Well, Art said, if you take the lump sum, you'll probably get about $154,050. Then the feds will step in, and after taxes, you'll be left with about $98,51,500. This should cover all taxes today and next year. The state doesn't tax lottery winnings, so you'll be fine. I would recommend setting up some trusts to protect your children and your farm. Al listened and then began to speak. I would suggest donating the farm, or most of it, to a state university, creating a trust in agriculture and agronomy. This would solve the freeway problem, and the trust would void the county's rezoning. It would also help to get the university's legal team on our side. Art and Jerry nodded and looked at Matt. Matt thought for a moment. I think what I'd like to do, he hesitated, is cash the ticket in a lump sum, pay off the mortgage on the farm, set aside about 150 acres for me and my family, and do as you said with the rest. I need to pay the hospital bill, fix the roof, get the house in order for what I have in mind, and pay all my other bills. Then create some trusts for my children that are not available until they are 10 years old. College age, or until age 23 if they decide not to go to college. Then some trust for me that will give me a little income, pay off my lawyer, he smiled at Al, and make some charitable donations. Maybe I could invest with Art or Jerry to hide the rest. Does that sound paranoid? Wow, said Al. Where did all this come from? Matt chuckled. From talking to you guys. Art was following the conversation, but was looking at his laptop. Well, it can take about 6-8 weeks to process the claim and get paid, but I think it's a good plan. Your debts are more urgent, so we will have to resolve them quickly. So we will have to give you some money to put off immediate debts, but I think we can do it. So the plan was ready. I signed some papers and everything started to come together. 3 days later, I cashed the ticket, my immediate debts were paid, and my lawyer contacted the university. When they found out what I was offering, they rushed to fulfill my conditions. The top big city law firm working for them immediately took matters into their own hands and offered a better deal. They allocated 200 acres, which I approved, and offered it to me for pennies. They then applied to create a trust with the Department of the Interior. Meanwhile, the ticket was recognized and paid within 12 weeks, and the money $97,046, 504.76 was deposited in our local bank. I immediately became a celebrity in town. My legal team paid off the farm loans, $276,675,000, and signed the trust papers, paying $231,000 to the university for the 200 acres with my home. With the farm payment paid off, my house paid off, hospital bill paid, farm taxes paid, home improvements, truck registration updated, and a bunch of other stuff left, I have $79,26,800 left from the lottery. They then created 4 trusts to pay for the children's college and gifted $3,000 to Mrs. Delano. I paid back all the money my friends advanced me and paid my free legal fees. I then paid off the building fund debts of the local Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, and Episcopal churches and the Jewish synagogue 2 towns away. When it was all said and done, I was left with $53,26,800. Between Jerry and Art, they set up a trust and several investment funds for my offspring. But wait, that's not all. Local media and the Lottery Commission, upon learning of the ticket owner's identity, his plight, and how he was using his money, made it national news. Everywhere, even in this little hick town of Las Vegas, Nevada. And guess who saw the news story between shifts dancers in a bar because her lover spent all her money and ran away? Lucille could only think that half of this money was hers. Not the smartest knife in the drawer, huh? She traded her body for a ride home, and 3 weeks later she showed up in town with a nosy lawyer in tow. Now, the legal hack representing Miss Herman was not privy to the details of the previous divorce. About the settlement, the declaration that she didn't want anything to do with brats, her extramarital affairs, her ex-boyfriend, nothing other than the fact that she was great at delivering pleasure and promised him $2 million when she won. So he filed for a review of the settlement and a ruling in her favor. However, Al Lozano was great. He immediately filed a counterclaim against her, citing the original divorce, court records, records of actions, her statement, and a written waiver of parental rights in exchange for a monetary payment. To top it all off, his research revealed that her lawyer was not licensed to practice in their state. The judge looked at the documents and dismissed the lawsuit. Lucille became hysterical. Before the court adjourned, the judge asked Matt if he had anything to say. Matt stood up and addressed his ex-wife. With a serious expression on his face, he said, You chose the right time to leave me, Lucille. Then he smiled. Thank you. One of the things Matt bought with the money he won was a 1-carat diamond engagement ring. He was almost sure that she would say yes, and he thought that he would go with her to choose engagement rings. He invited her father, Al, Gino, and Art to a small party in the yard. When the celebrations were in full swing and people were having a good time, he caught Alice and attracted attention. The noise died down and he turned to Alice, got down on one knee, and with a smile on the children's face and a ring in his hand, he calmly said, Alice Wallen, I love you more than anything in this world. Will you marry me? Alice immediately fainted. After the expected commotion and helping Alice recover, she showered him with a passionate kiss. I hope that was a yes, Matt croaked, trying to catch his breath. Karma smiled and clapped her hands. I hit the nail on the head, she thought. Now, relax a little. I have 2 jokes. The first one is from my 8-year-old granddaughter. What is a lazy kangaroo called? Pocket potatoes. Heh heh heh. Well, let's do it. Okay, my joke. How to distinguish a fort from a fortress? Just. The fortress has defensive fortifications. Old man humor. If you don't understand, ask a man to explain it to you. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.